I found an old family journal about the Black Plague. I should have kept it sealed. I never expected to find anything of significance while clearing out my great-aunt Theodora's house in Yorkshire. The elderly woman had lived alone for decades in the sprawling Victorian mansion, and after her passing at the age of 94, the task of sorting through her belongings fell to me. Most of her possessions were exactly what you'd expect: dusty furniture, outdated clothes, and box after box of faded photographs. But in the attic, buried beneath a stack of moldering blankets, I found something extraordinary: a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The cover was unmarked save for a single name written in flowing script: Aldrich Blackwood, 1665. My hands trembled as I opened it. Aldrich Blackwood had been a distant ancestor, a physician who lived through the Great Plague of London. I'd heard stories about him growing up, but I never knew any personal accounts had survived. The pages were remarkably well preserved, though the ink had faded to a rusty brown in places. As I began to read, I realized with growing unease that this was no ordinary physician's diary. 12th of May, 1665. Today I witnessed something that defies all medical knowledge I possess. The plague has begun to spread through London's streets, as we all feared it would. But there is something different about this outbreak, something that fills me with a deep and gnawing dread. I was called to attend young Thomas Whitmore, son of the merchant on Bread Street. The boy presented with the typical symptoms: fever, chills, and a small swelling in his neck. But when I examined the bubo more closely, I observed movement beneath the skin. Not the usual pulsing of infected tissue, but something deliberate, purposeful. When I lanced the swelling, what emerged was not merely pus and blood. I shall document this precisely, though my hand shakes to write it. The infected matter seemed to writhe of its own accord, and within it, I glimpsed what appeared to be minute, thread-like structures, twisting and coiling like tiny eels. Young Thomas expired within hours. His father begged me to examine the body, convinced some curse had befallen his son. I agreed, though I now wish I hadn't. The boy's lymph nodes, when extracted, contained more of these strange fibers. Under my microscope, they appeared almost crystalline, with complex branching patterns unlike anything I've encountered in my studies of the disease. I have preserved several samples. God forgive me, but I must understand what this is. 15th of May, 1665. 3 more cases today, all showing the same peculiar characteristics. The fibers appear in every sample I examine. They seem to grow more complex, more organized, with each passing day. I've begun sketching their patterns, though I fear my drawings do not do justice to their bizarre intricacy. My colleague, Drive, Edmund Halsey, believes I'm allowing fear and exhaustion to cloud my judgment. He claims I'm seeing patterns where none exist, that these are merely the typical signs of bubonic plague. But he hasn't observed them under the microscope as I have. He hasn't seen them move. I must document something else, though I hesitate to commit it to paper. The infected seem to share a common behavior in their final hours. They speak of visions, not the usual fevered hallucinations, but specific, consistent images. They describe vast networks of tunnels, branching endlessly beneath the earth. They whisper about something moving through these passages, something ancient that has been waiting. I tell myself these are merely the ravings of dying minds. Yet each patient describes the same scenes, down to the smallest detail. How can this be? 20th of May, 1665. I have made a terrible discovery. The samples I preserved, they've changed. The fibers have grown more numerous, forming intricate patterns that seem almost like writing in a language I cannot read. When I examine them, I feel a curious sensation, as if something is attempting to communicate through these bizarre structures. More disturbing still are the rats. London has always been plagued by them, but their behavior has become increasingly erratic. They gather in large groups, moving with an unnatural coordination. Yesterday, I observed a group of them in my laboratory, clustered around the cabinet where I keep my samples. They seem to be listening for something. I've begun to experience strange dreams. I see the tunnels my patients described, endless passages that seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Sometimes I hear whispers in languages that have never been spoken by human tongues. I tell myself this is merely the result of exhaustion and stress, but deep down, I know better. 25th of May, 1665. The infection rate is growing exponentially, but that is not what truly terrifies me. It's the patterns. They're everywhere now, in the spread of the disease through the city, in the way the rats move through the streets, in the very arrangement of the bodies we collect each morning. Everything follows the same branching structure I first observed in those tissue samples. I've started mapping these patterns, and what emerges is impossible to ignore. The disease isn't spreading randomly. It's creating something, building something, using us as its medium. Dr. Halsey visited again today. He seemed troubled by my research, especially my maps and drawings. He suggested I take some time to rest, mentioned that many physicians have been driven to madness by the horrors we witness. But his eyes lingered too long on my samples, and I noticed his hands trembling as he spoke. After he left, I discovered several of my samples were missing. 1st of June, 1665. I can no longer sleep. The dreams have become too intense, too real. In them, I walk through those endless tunnels, following the branching patterns that have become so familiar. But now I understand what they are, a root system, spreading through the very foundations of our city. And at the center of it all, something waits. Something that has been growing, feeding, preparing. The pattern of the infection, when mapped across London, creates a perfect replica of the structures I've observed in my samples. We are not dealing with a mere disease. We are dealing with something that thinks, that plans, that has been waiting in the earth since long before humans walked upon it. I've discovered references in ancient texts to similar outbreaks throughout history. The Black Death wasn't the first manifestation of this entity. It has emerged again and again, each time growing more complex, more organized. Learning from each attempt. Today I visited the Whitmores again. The entire family is now infected, but they're not dying. They're changing. The fibrous growths have spread throughout their bodies, visible beneath their skin like dark rivers. They speak in unison now, describing the same visions I see in my dreams. They told me it's almost ready. That soon it will be complete. I must do something. But who would believe me? How can I explain that what we call the plague is merely the visible portion of something far larger, far older, far more terrifying than we could ever imagine? 3rd of June, 1665. Dr. Halsey came to my house tonight, wild-eyed and rambling. He had taken my samples to study them himself, to prove me wrong. Instead, he found exactly what I had described. But he went further in his experiments than I had dared. He claims to have decoded the patterns, to have understood the messages they contain. What he told me cannot be true. Must not be true. But it explains everything. The consistent visions, the coordinated behavior of the infected, the precise patterns of the disease's spread. We are not dealing with a plague at all. We are dealing with something that has been waiting beneath our feet for millennia, slowly building itself using human bodies as raw material. The fibers we've observed are not symptoms of the disease, they are its true form, a vast network that connects all the infected into a single, growing organism. And now, after centuries of preparation, it's finally ready to. The entry ends abruptly here, the pen having skittered across the page in a jagged line. 4th of June, 1665. I write this in haste. They are coming for me. I can hear them in the streets below, not just the rats now, but the infected themselves, moving with that same horrible coordination. Dr. Halsey is with them. I saw him through my window, his skin rippling with those familiar patterns. I've hidden my research as best I can. This journal will go to my sister in Yorkshire, along with instructions that it should be preserved but never read. Some knowledge is too dangerous. The patterns are complete. The network is fully formed. Whatever has been growing beneath London is ready to emerge, to transform from an invisible web into something far more terrible. I understand now why the infected didn't die, why they changed instead. They were never meant to die. They were meant to become part of it. And now, I hear them on the stairs. The rats came first, hundreds of them, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that should not exist in such creatures. Behind them, I hear the shuffling steps of the infected. To whoever finds this journal, burn it. Burn it and forget everything you've read. Some things should remain buried, some knowledge should stay hidden. The patterns are everywhere now. Once you begin to see them, you can never stop. They're in the very fabric of our world, waiting to be activated, waiting to spread, waiting to. The writing ends here, replaced by a series of intricate, branching patterns drawn in what appears to be dried blood. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. The air in the attic felt heavier now, almost alive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I pressed the journal against my chest and listened. Faint creaks echoed from somewhere below, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly coordinated. Had something followed the journal here? Or worse, had it never left? I scrambled to my feet, kicking aside the rotting blankets that had hidden the journal. My mind screamed at me to destroy it, to follow Aldrich Blackwood's final plea, but I hesitated. This was my ancestors' work, a piece of history so chilling and profound it defied belief. Could I really destroy it? Could I live with the questions if I didn't? The house groaned, louder now, like the sound of distant whispers growing nearer. I could swear I felt the faintest vibration beneath my feet. I turned and rushed down the attic stairs, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. In the sitting room, I lit the fireplace with shaking fingers. The flames flickered uncertainly, as if reluctant to catch. I dropped the journal onto the hearth, but I couldn't bring myself to push it into the fire. Instead, I flipped it open one last time, scanning the pages for some sort of explanation, some way to end this nightmare. And then I saw it. The branching patterns Blackwood had drawn, the ones that seemed like gibberish before, were no longer just lines on the page. They moved, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably alive. My vision blurred, my breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, dropping the journal onto the floor. A sound filled the room, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder, more insistent. It was everywhere, surrounding me, echoing in my skull. I could hear the whispers now, clear and undeniable, in a language I couldn't understand but somehow recognized. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and swung it wildly at the journal, but as I struck it, the room erupted into chaos. The fire flared, casting grotesque shadows that danced like writhing tendrils across the walls. The journal lay open, its pages glowing with an unnatural light, the patterns within spreading outward like a living network. I ran. I don't remember much of how I got out of the house, only that I stumbled into the cold Yorkshire night with the whispers still echoing in my ears. The mansion behind me seemed to shudder, its windows glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the journal. I left it there. The house burned that night. Or at least, that's what I tell myself. When I returned days later with the authorities, it was nothing more than a pile of ash and rubble. No one questioned it. An old Victorian mansion collapsing wasn't surprising. But the journal, it was gone. Sometimes, late at night, I still see the patterns. In the cracks of my ceiling, in the branches of a tree outside my window, in the veins on the back of my hands. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there. I've tried to forget, to tell myself it was all in my mind, a hallucination brought on by stress and grief. But deep down, I know better. The patterns are waiting, and one day, they'll finish what they started.